What's going on? What is focused in this little area? Now I want you to notice the roads in this area. This was covering the most important road in the ancient world, which led from Europe to Asia and Africa. And everything came through this road. And the road came from Rome, crossed the sea from Philippi to Troas, or ancient Troy, and then came down the coast of Turkey. But when it got to Pergamum, the road split. And there were two ways you could continue on to Africa and Asia. It was right on the most important trade route. Furthermore, this was the area where East met West, where the mystery religions of the East collided with the religions of Greece and Rome from the West. And because of its prosperity, it was a highly cultured area. When you have enough wealth, you can build magnificent buildings, you can develop libraries and sports stadiums. So here was a whole area of the highest of pagan culture, and with it pagan religion. All the Eastern mystery religions had temples here. The Western gods of Greece and Rome all had temples here. It is a magnificent place if you're interested in archaeology. And what a civilization it must have been. But that still doesn't explain why Jesus should write letters to 7 churches right here. Now comes the great surprise, and this is probably new to most of you here. This was the area where, at the end of the 1st century AD, Satan had his headquarters. Satan, of course, can only be in one place at once. He's not everywhere. He has agents everywhere, demonic agents, to do his will, but he has to go to and fro in the earth or up to heaven. He has access to heaven, as Job chapter 1 will tell you. So he moves around. But on earth, he always has a base, a headquarters, and it is always high on a mountain, because he loves looking down on people. He loves surveying his kingdom, and so he chooses always a mountain as his headquarters. And we know from Jesus' letters to the churches that Satan at that time had his headquarters in Pergamum. And when Jesus wrote the letter to the church in Pergamum, he said, I know where you live. It's where Satan resides. It's where he has his seat. Now, what does all that mean? When we went to Pergamum, I understood it. I never understood it before. Pergamum is quite a small city, nestling at the root of a mountain, a sugarloaf-shaped mountain, about 1,000 meters high, which towers over the city and over the whole area. You can only get up there through a narrow, winding track, a little road you can get up. You can get a bus up there now. And on the top are the most magnificent ruins. The third largest library in the ancient world was up there on top of Mount Pergamum. And there are theaters up there, stadium, and temples.
On one side, it was a very beautiful city. But on the flip side, it was one of the darkest, eeriest cities in the whole Roman Empire.
The people of Pergamon were known as the Temple Keepers of Asia. The city had 3 temples dedicated to the worship of the Roman Emperor, another for the goddess Athena, and the great altar of Zeus, the king of the Greek gods. Many scholars believe this altar is the throne of Satan mentioned in the book of Revelation.
That word throne was first used to describe a chair that was used in a personal private residence. And it was the chair for the Lord of the house, the master of the house. The very fact that Jesus would use that word in this verse means Satan felt at home there. He sat on a throne there. It was his territory. He was the master of that house.
And this was the residence of Satan. And from the altar, every day, every night, there was smoke rising from a fire that was kept going by the priests. What a sight it must have been. From little Pergamum, the city below, you look up to the top of this mountain and you see the smoke as if it's a volcano ascending to Zeus, king of the gods.
The people of Pergamum worshipped a myriad of Greek and Roman gods, but when Christianity arrived with the belief in just one God, the city's pagan priests went on the attack, and their most famous victim was a man named Antipas. In the book of Revelation, Jesus called Antipas my faithful martyr. He was the bishop of Pergamum, ordained by the Apostle John, and his faith got the attention of the priests of Asclepius, who complained to the Roman governor in Pergamum. The priests testified that demons appeared to them in their dreams and told them that the prayers of Antipas were driving them out of the city.
He had cast out so many devils that the demons, the spirits, had been complaining to pagans, "You've got to do something about this Antipas."
Antipas was ordered to offer a sacrifice of wine and incense to a statue of the Roman emperor and declare that the emperor was Lord and God. He refused.
If you reject the divinity of the emperor, it's the equivalent of rejecting the city of Rome. And believers were killed for this.
Antipas was sentenced to death on the altar of Zeus. Most of that altar survives today, and surrounding it are some of the world's most famous marble friezes. They portray the battle between the Greek gods and the giants. At the top of the altar was a hollow bronze bull, designed for human sacrifice.
They would take the victim, place him inside the bull. They would tie him in such a way that his head would go into the head of the bull. Then light a huge fire under the bull. And as the fire heated the bronze, the person inside the bull would slowly begin to roast to death. And as the victim would begin to moan and would begin to cry out in pain, his cries would go through all of the pipes which were in the head of the bull, so it seemed to make the bull come alive.
Even in the midst of the flames, Antipas died praying for his church. A few years later, the Apostle John wrote the book of Revelation, mentioning the death of Antipas on this very spot.
I, John, was on the island that is called Patmos. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice. To the angel of the church in Pergamum write, I know your works, and where you dwell, where Satan's throne is. And you hold fast to my name, and did not deny my faith, even in the days in which Antipas was my faithful martyr, who was killed among you, where Satan dwells.
You can still see the square where it was. It's now planted with trees, but the temple is gone. And do you know where it is? It's in East Berlin. If ever you go to Berlin, go down the main highway through the Brandenburg Gate, a little further on down the Unter den Linden, and then look to the left, and you will see a large museum called the Museum of Pergamon. And inside you will find Satan's residence. A German archaeologist at the end of the 19th century transported it stone by stone to Germany and rebuilt it. Here are the steps up to the temple. Here are the three sides of the column. That's the size of the temple. Now imagine all this built on a 1,000-meter Sugarloaf Mountain, towering above the surrounding countryside. From here you could see miles and miles. And this was Satan's seat. It's like a huge armchair. It is a throne. And Jesus says in the letter to Pergamum, I know where you live. That's where Satan resides. That's where Satan's seat is. And you are now looking at Satan's seat. This does not mean that he is now residing in Berlin, though Christians in Berlin have gathered by the hundreds here to pray that it may go back to Turkey. Turkey wants it back, as others want things back from the British Museum. Many Christians have the idea that moving this to Berlin at the beginning of the 20th century had a profound effect on Germany and what happened in the last century there. Whatever. I'm quite sure Satan is not living here now, and don't all come and ask me afterwards where I think he's living now. I have my ideas, but they're only my speculation, and that's not worth listening to. However, to go back to the map we had, this had an amazing influence on the churches in the area. The churches that were nearest to Pergamum had one kind of problem. As you move further away from Satan's residence, the churches had a different kind of problem. And the two churches furthest away had a very different problem from the others. To put it simply, the two churches that were nearest to Satan's residence were both being corrupted from the inside by idolatry and immorality. The next two churches further away were both suffering not from the inside, but by persecution from the outside. And in both cases, Satan was using the Jews to persecute the Christians. And Jesus even dared to call their synagogue a synagogue of Satan. The Jews were used in the earliest days of the Christian church to persecute the Christians. Truth is that in the earliest days, Paul himself and his converts and the churches he founded were quite bitterly attacked by Jewish people. They saw these Jews believing in they saw the Christians as believing in a false Messiah. They did not believe that Jesus was the Christ, and that was the root of their hatred of the Christians. So, the two churches that were furthest away from Satan, he wasn't bothering at all. So what went wrong with those two? Well, one was Ephesus, and they had lost their first love. And the other was Laodicea, and they had become lukewarm. And churches that have lost their first love and become lukewarm, Satan doesn't bother them at all. He doesn't need to. They're not a threat to him. They're not likely to attack his kingdom. They will just carry on as they are. So have you got the picture? Pergamum, Satan resides. That's his base on earth. Why would he choose Pergamum? I've given you the answer. This area was the most important area in the whole world to control. It sat right over the east-west road. The road between Europe, Asia, and Africa passed right through here. Whoever controlled this situation could control the world, could influence the world. From here, news went out in every direction to all three of the continents of the then known world. Can you begin to see how strategic it was? Satan certainly thought so. He said, that's where I can control the world. And Jesus thought the same. And so we have here a direct conflict. The church is caught in a spiritual battle, and it's going to be very fierce. So we have Satan, Pergamum, then we have two churches being attacked from the inside by Satan through idolatry and immorality, compromise within the church. Then you have a little further away, Satan attacking churches from the outside and even using God's chosen people, the Jews, to do it. They are the two churches about whom Jesus has no criticism whatever. Jesus has nothing but support and sympathy for churches that are suffering. His major criticisms are directed at churches that are not suffering for him. I find that interesting. And particularly those two churches furthest from Satan that Satan doesn't need to bother with, Ephesus and Laodicea. We're going to be looking in more detail at those two in a moment. But have I painted a picture for you? Remember that this is the end of the 1st century AD. We're into 2nd and 3rd generation Christians. And I'm afraid church history is full of examples of a church that was full of enthusiasm and life at the beginning, but gradually, as they failed to pass on that zeal for the Lord to the 2nd and 3rd generation, the church becomes respectable, cool, not very loving, still doing all the right things, but somehow the fire has died down. Satan doesn't bother with those churches. Now, on a very simple principle, I look around the world today and I say, where are these kinds of churches? And I've come to the conclusion that Satan's headquarters cannot possibly be in America, or Britain, or Europe. I see the signs of his activity in the third world. That's where the church today is growing most rapidly, and where the tensions and spiritual battles are most fierce. So somewhere in the third world, I believe Satan has his residence today. I'm not going to be more specific than that. But when I look at some of the lukewarm churches and some of the loveless churches in our Western world, I know that Satan wouldn't even put them on his list that he needs to pay attention to. They're really not much threat to him. Well, now let's move on from that history and geography lesson, but you see how the background is so important when we come to the book of Revelation. And because these are 2nd and 3rd generation churches, Jesus is really facing the acid test of whether his church is going to remain faithful to him. Quite simply, if the churches could survive here, they would survive anywhere. If the churches could get through the end of the 1st century AD in the pressure of Greek and Roman culture and the money and the pleasure and everything going on here, strangely reminiscent of the modern world, they had everything that you've got on television except the television set. They had drama, they had comedy, they had sport, they had everything that people are watching in the Western world today, but they had to go out for it and watch it in situ, whereas we can lounge at home and switch it on and watch it in comfort. That's the only difference. The preoccupation of the leisure life here was exactly what it is in the world which you and I live in. Their great growth industry was leisure, and it is ours too.
I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, saith the Lord, which is, and which was, and which is to come, the Almighty. He which testifieth these things saith, surely I come quickly. Amen. Even so, come, Lord Jesus.